Shalom Aleichem Rabotai. Mishnah Yomi is continuing. We are starting the 8th chapter of Eiruvin. So 8th chapter of Eiruvin starts Ketzod Mishtatfin B'techumin. How do we make a shituf, a joining b'techumin, in a techum? Now this sounds a little bit odd because the last chapter we talked about shituf mavui, which is basically making an eruv over an alley which contains multiple courtyards. And then in the 5th chapter we talked extensively about techum. Techum is the amount a person can walk on Shabbat, but an eruv techumin was a mechanism for moving the center of that 2,000 amma circle so he could get somewhere else on Shabbat. So here in the 8th chapter, this Mishtatim and Techumin is talking about a multi-person eruv techumin. So you're moving the location for multiple people to allow multiple people to travel somewhere on Shabbat. So what does he do? Meniach et hachavit. He puts down a barrel. We've seen before you can use a barrel of wine or oil or the like. V'omer hareze lekol b'nei iri. This food is for all the people in my town. Lekol mi sheyelech. Anyone who's going leveta aval, leveta mishteh, who's going out to a house of mourning where the avelim are, or to a mishteh, a simcha. So we see that, as we learned before, that a eruv techumin is supposed to be made for the purposes of a mitzvah, such as to go to the daf yomi, and the daf yomi is in a base medrash that's out of the normal techum, so he would make an eruv techumin so he can get to the daf yomi or the mishnah yomi or the siyum or whatever it is. So here, one person is putting down a larger amount of food. We're going to see how much in Mishnah Bet to allow multiple residents of his city to go out of their default techum of the city and travel somewhere else for the needs of a mitzvah. The Mishnah continues, "V'kol shekibel mi ba'od yom mutter." Anyone who accepted this when it was still daytime is allowed to make use of this extension. Now, the Bartner explains from the Gemara, it's not just he didn't have to accept it. If he knew about it, that's good enough. And then even on Shabbat, if he knew about this communal eruv techum extension, he could still rely on it. But using breira, retroactive clarification, as we talked about, in the case where someone made a eruv techum both to the east and the west, you didn't know yet which direction the daf yomi shir would be. The Mishnah concludes, Mishet Techshach, but it's after Shkia, after it's already Shabbat, Asur Shein Mavarin Mishet Techshach. If he doesn't know about this multi-person communal eruv techumin until after dark on Friday night, then he cannot rely on it. Mishnah Bet Kama Hu Shura. What is the shiur of this multi-person eruv techumin? Mazon Shtei Seudot Lekol Echad. It has to be 2 meals for each person. So recall in the last parak, by the eruv and the sheet of mavli, it was just 2 meals total, or even 18 grogirot worth. But here it's 2 meals for each person because this is their Shabbat residence. They have to have enough food there to eat on Shabbat. It's as if that's their home and hearth and kitchen on the Shabbat at that place where they're placing this barrel for the eruv techumin from many people. So they need to have 2 meals per person. And the Mishnah explains, Mizono l'chol v'lo l'Shabbat divrei Rabbi Meir. And it's enough food for a weekday, for 2 weekday meals, not 2 Shabbat meals, according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda omer l'Shabbat v'lo l'chol. He says, no, it has to be 2 Shabbat meals, not 2 weekday meals. And the Mishnah explains, v'zei, both of them, mitkavnin, intend lahakel, to be lenient. Now the machlokas here is how much do you eat on Shabbos compared to a weekday? The Rebbe Meir's of the opinion that you eat more on Shabbos because the food is more appetizing, better prepared. It has that spice called Shabbos from the famous story of Rebbe and Antoninus. So you eat more on Shabbos than you usually do. So each meal on Shabbos is a bit larger. So he says use the weekday meal, it's smaller. Rabbi Yehuda says normally a person eats 2 meals a day. But on Shabbat, they eat 3 meals in a day. So each of those 3 meals is actually a little smaller than a weekday meal. So he's also trying to be makel on a person, saying, listen, you eat a little bit less bread on Shabbos than you would for during the normal week when you eat only 2 meals a day. It's also a reminder of something that later poskim talk about. Suda Shlishit, Shalosh Sudas, is, sometimes gets the short end of the breadstick. Because in the winter, at least, people are still full from lunch. Lunch can go till 2 or 3 p.m., and then they turn around an hour or 2 later and have another Suda is very difficult. So they say, Chacham in of Barosha. They say you should plan ahead, Shabbos lunch, Saturday lunch, don't eat too much and don't overeat. The Rambam says never overeat, but don't eat too much so you'll still have the ability to have the third Suda, the third Shabbos Suda. It's an important mitzvah that's often neglected due to our Baruch Hashem, the abundant blessings that the Ribono Shalom showers upon us. Now, how much bread this actually is, the Mishnah explains. Rabbi Yochanan beBerka Omer mikikar bepundion. It's when a loaf costs a pundion, ma'arba seyin besela. When 4 seah of the flour, the raw ingredient, costs a selah. Now, the Bartenura explains this in detail, the calculation here. He says this ends up being a loaf the size of 6 eggs. So it's a 6 kibetza loaf, approximately a 12-ounce loaf, and that's enough for 2 meals. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he says it's a little bit less. It's shtei yadot. It's 2 hands, meaning 2/3 lekikar of this loaf, mishalosh lekav. When there's 3 loaves in a kav, which is 4 log, which is 6 eggs. So it ends up being 5 1/3 eggs, according to Rabbi Shimon. So this shear of what's a standard size loaf, this 6-egg loaf, at least according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. So the Mishnah brings other areas this is important. Chetzia lebayis hamanuga. Half of this loaf is important to the bayis hamanuga, the infected house, the house that has tsaras, that has like splotches or blotches of tsaras, of contamination on the walls. Now, if somebody goes into such a house, he becomes tameh if he stays there long enough to eat chatzi pras, half of this loaf. So 3 egg size bread loaf. If he stays in the house long enough, then he and his clothing become ritually contaminated. And the Mishnah adds another time this is relevant, chatzi, half of a half, 1/4 of this 6-egg loaf, lifsala to gavia, to contaminate a body. Meaning, if he ate bread this size that was tameh, then he becomes puzzle. It's a weaker tuma. He can't eat truma anymore. Now, he's not actually tameh, but we render him tameh, so he does not eat truma, along with a contaminated loaf of this size, which is enough to spread tuma to him, and it's 1.5 eggs, according to Rabbi Yochanan Baroka, so please stay away from 1.5 eggs worth of contaminated bread. And Lamaise, the Rambam rules here that you do need the Rabbi Yochanan Baroka size. You need a 6-egg loaf per person to make this multi-person eruv techumin. Yeshar koach, sei gesund.